Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the briefing room of the USS Constellation, her crisp white uniform reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. The smell of salt water and diesel fuel permeated the air, a constant reminder of life aboard the massive aircraft carrier. Around her, 30 other naval officers sat in perfect rows, their eyes fixed on the imposing figure at the front of the room. Admiral Robert Harrison was a legend in the Navy. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, he commanded respect wherever he went. His chest was decorated with ribbons and medals that told the story of a distinguished career spanning 3 decades. He had served in conflicts around the world, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, earning a reputation as a brilliant strategist and fearless leader. But Sarah knew there was another side to Admiral Harrison. Behind the decorated exterior was a man who believed the Navy was no place for women, especially not in combat roles. He had made his views known through subtle comments and not-so-subtle policy recommendations. While he couldn't openly discriminate due to military regulations, he found ways to make his position clear. Today's briefing was supposed to cover new tactical procedures for submarine warfare. Sarah had been assigned to present the latest intelligence on enemy submarine movements in the Pacific. She had spent weeks preparing, analyzing satellite data, sonar readings, and classified reports from Allied navies. Her presentation was thorough, detailed, and strategically sound. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she noticed Admiral Harrison's expression. There was something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man preparing to make a point at someone else's expense. "Thank you, Commander Mitchell," Admiral Harrison said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "That was adequate. Though I must say, I'm curious about something." Sarah remained at attention. "Yes, sir." The Admiral stood and walked closer to where she stood. His footsteps echoed in the quiet room, and Sarah could feel the tension building among her fellow officers. They all knew Harrison's reputation, and many had witnessed his previous confrontations with female officers. "I've been reviewing personnel files lately," Harrison continued, his voice taking on a casual tone that somehow made it more menacing. "And I noticed something interesting about our submarine commanders. The statistics on confirmed enemy vessel eliminations are quite fascinating." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. She had a feeling she knew where this was heading. "Now, I understand that in today's modern Navy, we're all about equality," Harrison said, emphasizing the last word with barely concealed disdain. "But when it comes to actual combat effectiveness, well, the numbers don't lie." He paused. Sarah could see Captain Rodriguez, one of her mentors, clenching his jaw. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, who had served with Sarah on 2 previous assignments, looked like he wanted to say something, but knew better than to interrupt an admiral's monologue. "Commander Mitchell," Harrison continued, "I see here that you've been credited with 3 confirmed eliminations during your submarine command tours. 3 enemy vessels destroyed. That's impressive for someone of your background." The way he said "your background" made it clear he wasn't talking about her military training or experience. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "However," Harrison went on, beginning to pace in front of the assembled officers, "I can't help but wonder about the nature of warfare itself. You see, throughout history, combat has been the domain of warriors. Real warriors. Men who understand that taking a life, even an enemy life, is serious business." The room was dead silent now. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She knew she was being baited, but she also knew she had to be careful. One wrong word could end her career. "So I have to ask myself," Harrison said, stopping directly in front of Sarah, "how does someone like you handle the psychological pressure of command in combat? How do you deal with knowing that your decisions resulted in the deaths of enemy sailors?" Sarah looked straight ahead, not making eye contact with the Admiral. "Sir, I follow my orders and execute my duties according to military protocol and the rules of engagement." "Protocol?" Harrison repeated, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, of course. But what about the human element? What about the reality of taking lives in combat?" He turned to address the room. "You see, gentlemen and lady, this is what I'm talking about. The clinical, detached response. Where's the warrior spirit? Where's the understanding that combat is about more than just following protocol? Sarah felt something snap inside her. She had endured months of Harrison's subtle and not-so-subtle challenges to her competence, her courage, and her right to serve in combat roles. She had watched him undermine other female officers with the same tactics. She had bitten her tongue and followed proper channels, but nothing had changed. "With respect, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying a new edge, "you seem to be suggesting that enjoying combat or taking pleasure in enemy casualties is a sign of warrior spirit." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "I'm suggesting, Commander, that combat requires a certain mindset, a killer instinct, if you will. Something that can't be taught in a classroom or simulated in training exercises." "A killer instinct," Sarah repeated slowly. She could feel the attention of every officer in the room focused on this exchange. This was dangerous territory, but she was tired of backing down. "Yes," Harrison said, his voice growing more confident. He sensed he was gaining the upper hand in this confrontation. The ability to make split-second life-and-death decisions. The psychological fortitude to live with the consequences of those decisions. The warrior mentality that separates true naval officers from those who are simply playing soldier. The insult was clear, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. Sarah felt anger building inside her, but she also felt something else. A calm, cold clarity that she had experienced before in actual combat situations. "Admiral," she said quietly, "are you questioning my ability to make life-and-death decisions in combat? I'm questioning whether you truly understand the weight of those decisions." Harrison replied, "Whether you have the psychological makeup necessary for submarine warfare. Whether you can handle the reality of hunting and killing enemy targets." Sarah noticed that several officers were now looking uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. Captain Martinez was shaking his head slightly, and Commander Johnson was staring at the floor. They all knew this was inappropriate, but no one was willing to challenge an admiral. "I see," Sarah said. "So you believe that someone needs to have a particular attitude about killing to be effective in combat?" "I believe," Harrison said, his voice rising slightly, "that combat effectiveness requires more than just technical competence. It requires the right mindset, the ability to embrace the warrior ethos." "And you think I lack this mindset?" "I think," Harrison said, pausing for dramatic effect, "that some people are naturally suited for the realities of combat, and others are not. It's not a matter of training or qualifications. It's a matter of fundamental character." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words. The room was so quiet that the distant hum of the ship's engine seemed loud in comparison. "Admiral," she said finally, "you mentioned my kill count. 3 confirmed eliminations." "Yes," Harrison said, sensing victory, "which brings me back to my original point. How do you reconcile that number with your conscience? How do you sleep at night knowing that your decisions resulted in the deaths of enemy sailors?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that everyone had to lean forward to hear her. "Sir, I think there might be a misunderstanding about my service record." Harrison frowned. "What do you mean?" "You said I had 3 confirmed eliminations," Sarah continued, "but I think you might be looking at incomplete information." "Commander, I'm looking at official Navy records." "Yes, sir, but those records only reflect my submarine command tours." Sarah paused, meeting Harrison's eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. "They don't include my previous service assignments." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Harrison's face. "What previous assignments?" Sarah reached into her uniform jacket and pulled out a small folder. "With your permission, sir, I'd like to clarify my complete service record." Harrison nodded, though he looked less confident than he had moments before. Sarah opened the folder and began reading in a clear, steady voice. "Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, attached to SEAL Team 7 as Naval Intelligence Liaison, Operation Neptune's Fury, Afghanistan 2018. Confirmed eliminations. 12 enemy combatants." The room was completely silent now. Sarah continued reading. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Special Operations Command, Classified Mission Designation Ghostwater, Syria, 2020. Confirmed eliminations, 8 enemy operatives." Harrison's face was beginning to pale. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, attached to Marine Force Reconnaissance, Operation Desert Wind, Iraq, 2021. Confirmed eliminations. 15 enemy combatants. Sarah closed the folder and looked directly at Admiral Harrison. So to answer your question about my kill count, sir, the number isn't 3. It's 38 confirmed enemy kills across multiple theaters of operation, not counting probable eliminations or assists. The silence in the room was deafening. Several officers were staring at Sarah with expressions of shock and newfound respect. Admiral Harrison looked like he had been struck by lightning, but Sarah wasn't finished. You asked how I sleep at night, Admiral, she continued, her voice still calm and measured. The answer is that I sleep very well, because every one of those eliminations was necessary to protect American lives and advance American interests. I don't lose sleep over doing my job effectively. She took a step closer to Harrison, who seemed frozen in place. You also asked about the psychological pressure of command in combat. I can tell you that it's considerable, but the pressure doesn't come from taking enemy lives when necessary. The pressure comes from the responsibility to bring your people home alive. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. As for your question about warrior spirit and killer instinct, sir, I would respectfully suggest that true warrior spirit isn't about enjoying violence or taking pleasure in death. It's about being willing and able to use violence when necessary to protect your country and your fellow service members. Admiral Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he found himself completely speechless. Sarah wasn't done. You mentioned that some people are naturally suited for combat, and others are not. I agree with that assessment. But I would suggest that natural suitability for combat isn't determined by gender, background, or attitude. It's determined by training, dedication, competence under pressure, and the ability to make correct decisions quickly when lives are on the line. She gestured to her folder. My record speaks for itself in that regard. The room remained silent as Sarah gathered her papers and prepared to return to her seat. But before she could move, Admiral Harrison finally found his voice. Commander Mitchell, he said, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. I was not aware of your complete service history. No, sir, you weren't, Sarah replied simply, because you didn't bother to look. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. Harrison's face flushed red, but he couldn't deny the truth of her statement. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat. Admiral, if I may, Commander Mitchell's classified assignments wouldn't appear in standard personnel files. Access requires specific security clearances. Harrison nodded slowly, still looking stunned. Yes, of course. Sarah remained standing at attention, waiting to be dismissed. The other officers in the room were exchanging glances, unsure of what to do in this unprecedented situation. Admiral Harrison walked to the front of the room and stood behind the podium. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to regain his composure and his authority. Commander Mitchell, he said finally, your service record is impressive. Thank you, sir. However, Harrison continued, his voice strengthening as he tried to reassert control, my broader point remains valid. The modern Navy faces challenges in maintaining combat readiness while adapting to changing personnel policies. Sarah could see what he was doing, trying to salvage his position by making the conversation about policy rather than personal competence. She decided to let him have that escape route, for now. Yes, sir, she said simply. Very well, Harrison said. This concludes today's briefing. Dismissed. The officers began filing out of the room, but Sarah could hear whispered conversations starting as soon as they were out of Harrison's earshot. Word of this confrontation would spread throughout the ship within hours. As Sarah gathered her materials, Captain Rodriguez approached her. Commander, he said quietly, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. Sarah smiled slightly. Sometimes those are the same thing, sir. Indeed they are, Rodriguez agreed, but I have a feeling this isn't over. Sarah looked toward the front of the room where Admiral Harrison was still standing, staring at his notes. She could see the anger and humiliation in his posture. No, sir, she said. I don't think it is. The mess hall of the USS Constellation buzzed with conversation as Sarah Mitchell entered for lunch the following day. She could feel eyes following her as she moved through the serving line, and she caught fragments of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when the speakers noticed her approach. Word of yesterday's confrontation with Admiral Harrison had spread throughout the ship faster than she had expected. "Mitchell, call Lieutenant Commander Thompson from a table near the windows. Over here." Sarah made her way over to where Thompson sat with Captain Rodriguez and Commander Johnson. As she approached, she noticed that their conversation died down, and they were looking at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah asked, setting down her tray. "Please," Rodriguez said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We were just discussing yesterday's briefing." Sarah sat down and began eating, waiting to see where this conversation would lead. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was often better to listen than to speak.
"I have to say," Thompson began carefully, "I had no idea about your special operations background."
"It's classified information," Sarah replied, "not something that comes up in casual conversation." Johnson nodded. Still, the Admiral seemed pretty surprised. I don't think he was expecting that kind of response. "No," Sarah agreed. "He wasn't." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, can I give you some friendly advice?" "Of course, sir. Be careful," Rodriguez said quietly. "Harrison is not the kind of man who takes humiliation well. And what happened yesterday, that was humiliation, pure and simple." Sarah put down her fork and looked at Rodriguez. "Are you suggesting I should have let him continue his little demonstration?" "I'm not suggesting anything about what you should have done," Rodriguez clarified. "I'm talking about what happens next. Harrison has been in the Navy for 30 years. He has friends in high places, and he has a long memory." Thompson nodded in agreement. "Rodriguez is right. I've served under Harrison before. He's vindictive when he feels he's been wronged. And he definitely feels wronged," Johnson added. "The whole ship is talking about what happened." Some of the stories are getting pretty exaggerated, too. Sarah sighed. She had hoped that yesterday's confrontation might be the end of the matter, but she was beginning to realize that it might have been just the beginning. "What kind of stories?" she asked. Thompson glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Well, the basic facts are getting around, that Harrison questioned your combat record and you set him straight. But some people are saying you threatened him, or that you showed him classified documents without authorization." "Neither of those things happened," Sarah said firmly. "We know that," Rodriguez said. "We were there. But rumors have a way of taking on a life of their own, especially when they serve someone's purposes." As if summoned by their conversation, Admiral Harrison entered the mess hall. The room didn't fall silent, but Sarah noticed that conversations became more subdued. Harrison moved through the serving line with his usual authoritative bearing, but Sarah could see tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Harrison chose a table across the room, but Sarah caught him glancing in her direction several times. When their eyes met, his expression was cold and calculating. "He's planning something," Johnson observed quietly. "Probably," Sarah agreed. "The question is what?" She didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 hours later, Sarah was in her quarters reviewing intelligence reports when her door chime sounded. She opened it to find Yeoman First Class Williams, one of Admiral Harrison's staff members. "Commander Mitchell," Williams said, standing at attention. "Admiral Harrison requests your presence in his quarters at 1400 hours. "Did he say what this was regarding?" Sarah asked. "No, ma'am. Just that you were to report to him immediately after your current duty shift." Sarah checked her watch. It was 13:30. "Very well. Thank you, Yeoman." Williams saluted and departed, leaving Sarah to wonder what Harrison had planned. She spent the next 30 minutes reviewing regulations and protocols, trying to anticipate what he might try to do. At exactly 1400 hours, Sarah knocked on the door to Admiral Harrison's quarters. His enter was sharp and authoritative. Harrison's quarters were spacious by Navy standards, with a small sitting area separate from his office space. The walls were decorated with photographs from his various assignments and commendations from his long career. Harrison was seated behind his desk, writing on a tablet computer. "Commander Mitchell reporting as requested, sir," Sarah said, standing at attention. Harrison didn't look up immediately. He continued writing for another 30 seconds. A deliberate power play designed to make Sarah uncomfortable. When he finally set down his stylus and looked at her, his expression was ice cold. "Have a seat, Commander," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Sarah sat down, maintaining her military bearing, while mentally preparing for whatever was coming next. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Harrison began, "and I've realized that there are some serious issues we need to address." "What kind of issues, sir?" Harrison pulled up a file on his computer screen and turned it so Sarah could see it. "I've been reviewing your personnel records more thoroughly. Your complete records, including your classified assignments." Sarah's stomach tightened slightly. She had revealed information about her Special Operations Service, but she hadn't provided specific details. Harrison must have used his security clearance to access her full file. "I see," Sarah said carefully. "Do you?" Harrison asked. "Because what I see here raises some very troubling questions about your conduct and your judgment." He pulled up another screen. "For instance, there's this incident report from your time with SEAL Team 7. It seems you disobeyed direct orders from your commanding officer during Operation Neptune's Fury." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Sir, that incident was fully investigated, and I was cleared of any wrongdoing." "Oh, you were cleared," Harrison agreed. "But the report still shows a pattern of insubordination when you disagree with your superior's decisions." He scrolled to another document. "And here we have a psychological evaluation from your time in Special Operations that questions your ability to work effectively within established command structures. That evaluation was conducted after a classified mission where I had to make independent decisions due to communication failures," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite her growing anger. "The psychologist ultimately concluded that my actions were appropriate given the circumstances." "Appropriate," Harrison repeated. "But the evaluation still notes concerns about your tendency to act unilaterally when you feel your superiors are making mistakes." Sarah began to see where this was heading. Harrison was building a case against her, using selective interpretations of her personnel records to paint a picture of an insubordinate officer who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here," Sarah said. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "What I'm trying to accomplish, Commander, is to understand how an officer with your history of disciplinary issues ended up in a position of responsibility on my ship." "Disciplinary issues?" Sarah's voice rose slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "Sir, I have never received any official disciplinary action in my entire career." "No official action, perhaps," Harrison agreed, "but a pattern of behavior that suggests difficulty with authority. Combined with yesterday's outburst in the briefing room—" "Yesterday's outburst?" Sarah interrupted. "Sir, you publicly questioned my competence and military record." "I simply corrected your misconceptions. You interrupted a superior officer and revealed classified information without authorization," Harrison countered. "Information that should never have been discussed in an open briefing." Sarah realized that Harrison was reframing the entire incident to make her look like the aggressor. It was a clever strategy, and she could see how it might be effective with people who hadn't been in the room. "Admiral," she said carefully, "you specifically asked me about my kill count and my ability to handle combat stress. I responded to your direct questions." "I asked general questions about the psychological pressures of command," Harrison said. "You chose to reveal specific details about classified operations. That shows extremely poor judgment." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control her anger. "Sir, may I ask what the purpose of this meeting is?" Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The purpose, Commander, is to inform you that I'm recommending you for immediate transfer off this ship." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "On what grounds?" "Insubordination, poor judgment in handling classified information, and inability to work effectively within established command structures," Harrison said, reading from his computer screen. "All documented in your personnel files." "Those files have been taken completely out of context," Sarah protested. "That's your opinion," Harrison said. "My opinion is that you represent a risk to unit cohesion and military discipline. I cannot have officers on my ship who think they can challenge their superiors whenever they disagree with them." Sarah stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is retaliation, pure and simple. You're angry because I embarrassed you in front of the other officers." Harrison's expression didn't change. "Commander, I would be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove, especially given your documented history of insubordination. Sarah realized she was trapped. Harrison had carefully constructed a narrative using her own personnel files, and she had no way to counter it without making herself look even more insubordinate. When would this transfer take effect? She asked quietly. As soon as we reach port, Harrison said, which should be in approximately 10 days. You'll be transferred to a desk job at Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Washington. I'm sure you'll find it educational. The message was clear. Harrison wasn't just transferring her off his ship, he was effectively ending her operational career. Desk assignments for officers with her background were usually a prelude to early retirement. Is there anything else, sir? Sarah asked. Just this, Harrison said, his voice taking on a mock-friendly tone. I hope you'll use this experience to reflect on the importance of respecting military hierarchy. The Navy functions on discipline and order, Commander. When officers start thinking they can challenge their superiors based on their personal opinions, the entire system breaks down. Sarah saluted sharply. Will that be all, sir? Dismissed, Harrison said, already turning back to his computer. Sarah left Harrison's quarters feeling like she was in a daze. She walked through the ship's corridors without really seeing where she was going, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. By the time she reached her own quarters, word of her transfer was already beginning to spread. Her door chime sounded almost immediately after she entered. It was Captain Rodriguez. Sarah, he said as soon as the door closed behind him. I just heard. Is it true? It's true, Sarah said, slumping into a chair. Harrison is transferring me off the ship. Effective as soon as we reach port. Rodriguez sat down across from her. On what grounds? Sarah explained the meeting with Harrison, including his selective use of her personnel files to build a case for insubordination. That's ridiculous, Rodriguez said when she finished. Anyone who knows your record would see through that immediately. But not everyone knows my record, Sarah pointed out. And Harrison is very good at presenting information in a way that supports his position. This is wrong, Sarah. There has to be something we can do. Sarah shook her head. Harrison has the authority to request transfers, and he's built a plausible case based on documented incidents in my file. Even if those incidents are being taken out of context, they still happened. So, what are you going to do? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally. Fight it, I suppose. But Harrison has 30 years in the Navy and friends at every level. I'm just a commander with a history of classified assignments that most people know nothing about. Rodriguez stood up and began pacing. This sets a terrible precedent. If Harrison can destroy an officer's career just because they stood up to him, what does that say about the Navy? It says that some things never change, Sarah replied bitterly. Despite all the policies and regulations about equality and fair treatment, the old boys' network is still alive and well. Maybe, but I'm not ready to give up yet.
What do you mean? Rodriguez stopped pacing and looked at her. I mean that Harrison might have overplayed his hand.
He's so angry about what happened that he's not thinking clearly. I don't follow. Think about it, Rodriguez said. Harrison just recommended transferring one of the most decorated special operations veterans in the Navy because she hurt his feelings. When the full story comes out, and it will come out, he's going to look petty and vindictive. Sarah considered this. Maybe. But by then it might be too late for my career. Not necessarily, Rodriguez said. There are people in the Navy who know your real value, Sarah. People who understand what you've contributed to our military effectiveness. People like who? Rodriguez smiled grimly. People like Admiral Catherine Reeves. Sarah's eyes widened. Admiral Reeves was the first woman to command the Pacific Fleet, and she had a reputation for supporting talented officers regardless of their gender or background. You think Admiral Reeves would intervene? I think Admiral Reeves would be very interested to know that one of her most effective special operations veterans is being transferred to a desk job because she embarrassed a sexist admiral, Rodriguez said. Especially if that admiral used questionable methods to build his case. For the first time since leaving Harrison's quarters, Sarah felt a spark of hope, but she also felt a familiar sense of caution that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. That's a dangerous game, she said. If Harrison finds out we're going around him, he could make things even worse. Sarah, Rodriguez said, they're already as bad as they can get. What's Harrison going to do? Transfer you twice. Sarah laughed despite herself. I suppose you have a point. The question is whether you're willing to fight, Rodriguez said. Because if you are, I think we might have a chance. Sarah thought about all the battles she had fought throughout her career. She had faced enemy combatants in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. She had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. She had proven herself over and over again, only to find herself facing the same doubts and challenges because of her gender. Yes, she said finally. I'm willing to fight. Rodriguez nodded. Good. Because I have a feeling this is about to become much bigger than just a dispute between you and Harrison. What do you mean? I mean that word of this is already spreading throughout the Navy, and there are a lot of people who are tired of watching qualified officers get pushed around by dinosaurs like Harrison. Sarah felt a chill of both fear and anticipation. She had wanted to avoid making this a bigger issue, but it seemed like that choice was being taken out of her hands. Rodriguez, she said, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that it might be time for someone to take a stand, Rodriguez said. Not just for you, but for every qualified officer who's been undermined by people like Harrison. Sarah realized that her confrontation with Admiral Harrison had set something in motion that was much larger than she had anticipated. The question now was whether she was ready for what came next. Admiral Catherine Reeves stood at the windows of her office, overlooking Pearl Harbor, watching the sun rise over the Pacific Fleet. As commander of the Pacific Fleet, she was responsible for one of the most powerful naval forces in the world. But this morning, her attention was focused on a personnel report that had landed on her desk the previous evening. The report detailed Admiral Harrison's request to transfer Commander Sarah Mitchell to a desk position at Naval Intelligence Headquarters. On the surface, it appeared to be a routine personnel action, the kind of transfer request that crossed her desk dozens of times each month. But several things about this particular request had caught her attention. First, the timing was suspicious. Commander Mitchell was currently serving aboard the USS Constellation, one of the Navy's most important operational platforms. Her expertise in submarine warfare and intelligence analysis made her a valuable asset in the current strategic environment. Transferring such an officer without clear operational necessity was unusual. Second, Admiral Harrison's justification for the transfer raised red flags. The report cited concerns about Mitchell's ability to work within established command structures, but it was vague on specifics. Reeves had learned to read between the lines of such reports, and this one had the distinct smell of a personal vendetta. Third, and most importantly, Reeves knew Commander Mitchell's actual service record. While most of Mitchell's special operations assignments were classified, Reeves had the security clearance to access the full details. What she saw there painted a picture of an exceptionally capable officer with a distinguished combat record. Reeves turned away from the window and sat down at her desk. She pulled up Mitchell's complete personnel file on her computer and began reading through it systematically. The more she read, the more convinced she became that Admiral Harrison's transfer request was motivated by something other than legitimate operational concerns. Her intercom buzzed. Admiral Reeves, her aide announced. Captain Rodriguez is here for his appointment. Send him in, Reeves replied. Captain Rodriguez entered and stood at attention. Reeves had known Rodriguez for several years and respected his judgment and integrity. If he had requested this meeting, it was for a good reason. At ease, Captain, Reeves said. Please, have a seat. I understand you have some concerns about a personnel matter aboard the Constellation. Rodriguez sat down, clearly choosing his words carefully.
Yes, ma'am.
It concerns Commander Sarah Mitchell and her requested transfer. I've reviewed Admiral Harrison's report, Reeves said. But I suspect there's more to the story than what's in the official documentation. There is, ma'am. Rodriguez proceeded to give Reeves a detailed account of the confrontation between Harrison and Mitchell, as well as the subsequent meeting where Harrison informed Mitchell of her transfer. Reeves listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her tablet. When Rodriguez finished, she was quiet for several minutes. Captain, she said finally, These are serious allegations. You're essentially saying that Admiral Harrison is retaliating against Commander Mitchell because she embarrassed him in front of other officers. That's exactly what I'm saying, ma'am, Rodriguez replied, and I'm not the only one who sees it that way. Word is spreading throughout the fleet, and it's not reflecting well on Navy leadership. Reeves frowned. What do you mean? Ma'am, Commander Mitchell's real service record is becoming known. Her special operations background, her combat experience, her actual qualifications. When people learn that an officer with her credentials is being transferred to a desk job because she stood up to sexist comments, it raises questions about our commitment to equal treatment and merit-based advancement. Reeves understood the implications immediately. The Navy had spent years working to improve its treatment of female officers and eliminate discrimination. If word spread that a decorated combat veteran was being punished for challenging sexist behavior, it could undermine those efforts and create serious public relations problems. Captain, do you have any documentation to support these allegations? She asked. I have statements from several officers who witnessed the original confrontation, Rodriguez said, and I believe Commander Mitchell would be willing to provide a detailed account of her meeting with Admiral Harrison. Reeves nodded. I'll need to speak with her directly. Can you arrange for her to report to me? Yes, ma'am. When would you like to see her? Reeves checked her schedule. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. And Captain, this conversation is to remain confidential until I've completed my review. Understood, ma'am. After Rodriguez left, Reeves spent the rest of the day reviewing regulations and precedents related to transfer requests and personnel disputes. She also made several discreet phone calls to colleagues who knew both Harrison and Mitchell professionally. The picture that emerged was troubling. Harrison had a reputation for being difficult to work with, particularly for female officers. While he had never been formally accused of discrimination, several people mentioned incidents where he had questioned the competence or qualifications of women under his command. Mitchell, on the other hand, was consistently described as an outstanding officer with exceptional abilities. The few people who knew about her special operations background spoke of her with something approaching awe. The next morning, Commander Mitchell reported to Admiral Reeves' office precisely at 0800. Reeves had seen Mitchell's photograph in her personnel file, but meeting her in person gave a different impression. Mitchell carried herself with the confident bearing of an experienced combat veteran, but there was also a wariness in her eyes that spoke to recent stress. Commander Mitchell, Reeves said, please have a seat. I want to discuss your current situation aboard the Constellation. Yes, ma'am, Mitchell replied, sitting down while maintaining perfect military posture. I've reviewed Admiral Harrison's request for your transfer, Reeves continued. But I've also spoken with Captain Rodriguez about the circumstances that led to that request. I'd like to hear your version of events. Mitchell gave a detailed and measured account of both her confrontation with Harrison and their subsequent private meeting. She was careful to stick to facts and avoid emotional language, but Reeves could hear the frustration and anger beneath her professional demeanor. Commander, Reeves said when Mitchell finished, do you believe Admiral Harrison's actions constitute retaliation for your comments during the briefing? Mitchell was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her response. Ma'am? I believe Admiral Harrison felt that I embarrassed him in front of other officers. His subsequent actions seemed designed to punish me for that embarrassment, rather than address any legitimate concerns about my performance. And how do you feel about the transfer itself? Admiral, with respect, I believe the transfer would effectively end my operational career, Mitchell said. Desk assignments for officers with my background are typically a prelude to early retirement or resignation. I've spent 15 years building expertise in submarine warfare and intelligence analysis. Moving to a desk job would waste that expertise and eliminate my ability to contribute meaningfully to naval operations. Reeves nodded. She had reached the same conclusion about the transfer's implications. Commander, I want you to know that I take these allegations very seriously, Reeves said. Retaliation against officers who raise legitimate concerns is contrary to Navy values and regulations. If that's what happened here, it will be addressed. Thank you, ma'am, Mitchell replied. However, Reeves continued, I also want you to understand that challenging this transfer will likely generate significant attention. Admiral Harrison has many supporters in the Navy hierarchy. Are you prepared for that? Mitchell met Reeves's eyes directly. Admiral, I've spent my career fighting for American interests overseas. I'm prepared to fight for American values here at home as well. Reeves smiled slightly. She liked Mitchell's directness and courage. Very well, she said. I'm going to suspend Admiral Harrison's transfer request pending a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding it. You will remain aboard the Constellation until that investigation is complete. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Reeves warned. This investigation will likely be uncomfortable for everyone involved. Admiral Harrison will not be pleased, and he may make your life difficult while it's ongoing. I understand, ma'am. After Mitchell left, Reeves immediately called the Navy Inspector General's office to initiate a formal investigation. She also sent a coded message to Admiral Harrison informing him that the transfer request was being reviewed and that he should take no further action regarding Commander Mitchell pending the outcome of that review. Harrison's response came within an hour. He requested an immediate meeting with Reeves to discuss what he termed inappropriate interference in his command decisions. Reeves scheduled the meeting for that afternoon. Admiral Harrison arrived at Reeves's office looking confident and slightly indignant. He was a tall, imposing man who was accustomed to getting his way through force of personality and institutional authority. Admiral Reeves, he said after they exchanged salutes, I have to express my concerns about your decision to suspend my transfer request. Commander Mitchell is my officer, assigned to my ship. Personnel decisions should be mine to make. Reeves gestured for Harrison to sit down. Admiral, you're absolutely right that personnel decisions are normally yours to make. However, when those decisions appear to be based on personal animus rather than operational necessity, they become my concern as well. Harrison's face reddened slightly. Personal animus? Admiral, I'm not sure what you've been told, but my decision was based entirely on Commander Mitchell's documented pattern of insubordination and poor judgment. I've reviewed her complete personnel file. Reeves replied calmly. I don't see any pattern of insubordination. I see isolated incidents that were fully investigated and resolved in her favor. Those incidents demonstrate her inability to work effectively within command structures, Harrison insisted. Combined with her recent outburst during a briefing, they paint a clear picture of an officer who cannot be trusted to follow orders. Reeves pulled up her notes from her conversation with Mitchell. According to multiple witnesses, Commander Mitchell's outburst was actually a response to your questions about her combat record and psychological fitness for duty, questions that were inappropriate and potentially discriminatory. Harrison's confident expression wavered slightly. I was conducting a legitimate review of personnel qualifications. In front of 30 other officers? Without prior notice or preparation? Admiral, that's not a personnel review. That's a public humiliation attempt. I resent that characterization, Harrison said, his voice rising. I was trying to make a point about combat readiness and warrior mentality. And what point was that exactly? Harrison realized he was being led into dangerous territory. The point was that not all officers are equally suited for combat roles. Based on what criteria? Reeves asked. Commander Mitchell has more combat experience than most officers on your ship. She has an exceptional record of performance under pressure. What exactly made you question her suitability? Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Admiral, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. I don't think I am, Reeves replied. I think you made assumptions about Commander Mitchell based on her gender rather than her qualifications. When she corrected those assumptions publicly, you decided to retaliate against her. That's completely false, Harrison protested. This has nothing to do with gender. Reeves opened another file on her computer. Admiral, I've made some discreet inquiries about your leadership style. This isn't the first time concerns have been raised about your treatment of female officers. Harrison's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean that there's a pattern here, Admiral. Multiple incidents where you've questioned the competence or qualifications of women under your command. Multiple cases where female officers have requested transfers away from your ships. Until now, these incidents haven't risen to the level requiring formal investigation. But this case is different. Different how? Because Commander Mitchell is not going to quietly transfer away and disappear. She's going to fight this, and when she does, all of those previous incidents are going to become relevant. Harrison was beginning to look genuinely worried. Admiral Reeves, Surely we can resolve this matter without a formal investigation. If there have been misunderstandings about my leadership style, I'm willing to address them through appropriate counseling or training. Reeves considered this. Part of her was tempted to accept Harrison's offer and resolve the matter quietly. Formal investigations were time-consuming and disruptive, and they rarely enhanced anyone's career. But she also knew that quietly resolving discrimination complaints was part of the problem. Too many capable officers had been quietly transferred or encouraged to resign rather than fight discriminatory treatment. The pattern continued because there were rarely consequences for the officers responsible. "Admiral," she said finally, "I appreciate your willingness to address these issues, but I believe this matter has gone too far for a quiet resolution. The investigation will proceed as planned." Harrison stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Admiral Reeves, I think you're making a serious mistake. Commander Mitchell is not the victim here. She's an insubordinate officer who embarrassed her commanding officer and is now trying to avoid the consequences of her actions." "That may be your opinion, Admiral," Reeves replied, "but the investigation will determine the facts." After Harrison left, Reeves sat back in her chair and considered what she had just set in motion. Harrison was right about one thing. This was going to be a serious matter, with far-reaching consequences. If the investigation supported Mitchell's allegations, it would likely end Harrison's career and send a strong message throughout the Navy about the consequences of discriminatory behavior. If, on the other hand, the investigation found that Harrison's actions were justified, it would vindicate his position and potentially damage the careers of everyone who had supported Mitchell. Reeves realized she was gambling with multiple careers, including her own, but she also knew that sometimes leadership required taking risks to do the right thing. She picked up her phone and called the Inspector General's office to confirm that the investigation would begin immediately. Whatever the consequences, she was committed to seeing this through to the end. Meanwhile, aboard the USS Constellation, word of the suspended transfer was spreading quickly through the ship's informal communication networks. Officers and enlisted personnel alike were discussing the implications, and opinions were sharply divided. Some supported Commander Mitchell, viewing her as a victim of discriminatory treatment who had finally stood up for herself. Others supported Admiral Harrison, seeing him as a respected leader who was being unfairly attacked by a subordinate who couldn't handle criticism. The division was creating tension throughout the ship, with officers choosing sides and avoiding conversations with colleagues who disagreed with their positions. The normal camaraderie that bound the crew together was being strained by the controversy. Commander Mitchell found herself at the center of this storm, unable to avoid the stares and whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. Some officers went out of their way to show support, while others maintained a careful distance to avoid being associated with the controversy. Captain Rodriguez watched these developments with growing concern. He had hoped that Admiral Reeves's intervention would resolve the matter quickly, but it was becoming clear that the investigation would take time, and the uncertainty was taking a toll on ship morale. He decided to call a meeting of his senior staff to address the situation directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the assembled officers, "I know that recent events aboard this ship have created tension and uncertainty. I want to address that directly." The officers listened attentively, unsure of what Rodriguez was going to say. "First, I want to make it clear that the investigation into recent personnel matters will be conducted by appropriate authorities outside our chain of command. Neither Admiral Harrison nor Commander Mitchell will face any retaliation for their participation in that investigation." He paused to let this sink in. "Second, I expect all personnel to conduct themselves professionally and avoid taking sides in this matter. We have important missions to complete, and we cannot allow personal controversies to interfere with our operational effectiveness." Lieutenant Commander Thompson raised his hand. "Captain, what should we do if we're contacted by investigators?" "Tell the truth," Rodriguez replied simply. "If you witnessed relevant events, describe what you saw accurately and completely. If you have opinions about what happened, keep them to yourself unless specifically asked." Commander Johnson spoke up. "Sir, some of the crew are asking questions about the investigation. How should we respond?" "Tell them what I've told you," Rodriguez said, "that the matter is being investigated by appropriate authorities and that we will continue to focus on our missions while that investigation proceeds." Rodriguez looked around the room. Are there any other questions? The officers shook their heads. Very well, Rodriguez said. Dismissed. As the officers filed out, Rodriguez wondered how long the ship could maintain this delicate balance. The investigation would likely take weeks or even months to complete, and the uncertainty was already affecting morale and unit cohesion. He also wondered about the broader implications of the controversy. If word spread beyond the Navy, it could become a public relations nightmare that would reflect poorly on the entire service. But there was no going back now. The investigation had been initiated, and everyone involved would have to live with the consequences of wherever it led. 6 weeks after Admiral Reeves initiated the investigation, Inspector General Captain Maria Santos sat in her office reviewing the final report. The investigation had been thorough and complex, involving interviews with dozens of personnel, review of classified documents, and analysis of Admiral Harrison's complete command history. What she had discovered painted a disturbing picture that went far beyond the single incident involving Commander Mitchell. Santos had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning Harrison's entire command career. Female officers under his command were systematically given less favorable assignments. Their fitness reports contained subtle language that questioned their leadership potential, and their requests for operational roles were frequently denied for reasons that didn't apply to their male counterparts. The investigation had also revealed that Harrison's treatment of Commander Mitchell was part of a broader strategy to discourage women from pursuing combat roles. Several female officers who had previously served under Harrison reported similar experiences of having their qualifications questioned publicly and their career advancement blocked through administrative means. Most damning of all was the discovery that Harrison had been coordinating with other senior officers to limit female advancement in submarine and special operations communities. Email communications recovered from Harrison's personal accounts showed discussions about maintaining traditional standards and concerns about social experimentation in combat roles. Santos picked up her secure phone and called Admiral Reeves. Admiral, this is Captain Santos. The investigation is complete. I think you need to see these findings immediately. Is it that serious? Reeves asked. It's worse than we initially thought, Santos replied. This isn't just about one incident or one officer. We're looking at a systematic pattern of discrimination that could have legal implications beyond military justice. Reeves was quiet for a moment. I'll be there in an hour. When Reeves arrived at Santos's office, she found the Inspector General surrounded by stacks of documents and computer printouts. Santos looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept much during the investigation. Admiral, Santos began, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what we've uncovered. For the next 2 hours, Santos walked Reeves through the investigation findings. She showed her the pattern of discriminatory fitness reports, the denied advancement opportunities, the coordinated efforts to limit female participation in combat roles, and the communications with other officers who shared Harrison's views. By the time Santos finished, Reeves was visibly shaken. Maria, she said, this is not just a personnel matter anymore. This is a violation of federal law. We're talking about systematic discrimination based on gender, which could result in criminal charges. I know, Santos replied. That's why I've already contacted the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They're going to want to review everything we've found. Reeves stood up and began pacing. What about the other officers Harrison was communicating with? That's still under investigation, Santos said. But it appears that several senior officers in submarine and special operations commands were aware of and participating in these discriminatory practices. How many careers have been damaged? Reeves asked. Santos consulted her notes. We've identified at least 15 female officers whose advancement was directly impacted by Harrison's actions over the past decade. There are probably more that we haven't found yet. Reeves felt sick. The scope of the discrimination was far worse than she had imagined, and the implications for the Navy's reputation were staggering. What do you recommend for immediate action? She asked. First, Admiral Harrison needs to be relieved of command immediately, Santos said. His continued presence aboard the Constellation is compromising the investigation and creating a hostile environment for potential witnesses. Done, Reeves said. What else? Second, We need to contact all the female officers we've identified as victims and offer them the opportunity to file formal complaints. Some of them may have legal claims for damages related to lost career opportunities. And third? Santos hesitated. Third, we need to prepare for this to become public. Once the Justice Department gets involved, there's no way to keep it quiet. The media is going to have a field day with this story. Reeves nodded grimly. She had been dreading this possibility, but she knew it was inevitable. All right, she said. Let's start with relieving Harrison. I'll handle that personally. 2 hours later, Admiral Reeves was aboard a helicopter flying toward the USS Constellation. She had never relieved a senior officer of command before, but the evidence against Harrison was overwhelming. There was no choice but to act decisively. When she arrived aboard the Constellation, Captain Rodriguez met her at the landing pad. The look on his face told her that he already suspected why she was there. Captain Rodriguez, she said, I need you to assemble all senior staff in the briefing room immediately, and have Admiral Harrison report to me in his quarters. Yes, ma'am, Rodriguez replied. Admiral, if I may ask, is this about the investigation? It is, Reeves confirmed. And I'm afraid the news is not good. 20 minutes later, Reeves stood outside Admiral Harrison's quarters and knocked on the door. When Harrison opened it, she could see in his expression that he knew this moment was coming. Admiral Harrison, she said formally, I'm here to inform you that you are being relieved of command effective immediately. Harrison's face went white, but he maintained his military bearing. On what grounds? On grounds of conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of equal opportunity regulations, and abuse of command authority, Reeves replied. The investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic discriminatory behavior spanning your entire command career. Harrison stepped back and gestured for Reeves to enter his quarters. Once the door was closed, his composure finally cracked. Catherine, he said, using her first name for the first time in years, you're making a terrible mistake. This witch hunt is going to destroy the Navy's combat effectiveness. Robert, Reeves replied, the only thing destroying Navy effectiveness is officers like you who waste talent because of personal prejudices. Harrison's face flushed red. Personal prejudices? I've dedicated my life to naval excellence. I've commanded ships in combat zones and trained thousands of officers. And you're going to throw that all away because some female officer couldn't handle criticism? This isn't about one officer, Robert, Reeves said quietly. We've found evidence that you've been systematically discriminating against female officers for years. We've found communications showing that you coordinated with other officers to block women from advancement opportunities. Harrison was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, defeated rather than angry. Catherine, you don't understand what's at stake here. Combat effectiveness isn't about political correctness or social engineering. It's about having the best people in the right positions when lives are on the line. And how do you determine who the best people are, Robert? Experience. Proven performance under pressure. The ability to make hard decisions and live with the consequences. Like Commander Mitchell? Reeves asked. Harrison looked away. Mitchell is an exceptional case. No, Robert, she's not. She's exactly the kind of officer the Navy needs more of. Highly trained, combat experienced, mentally tough, and completely dedicated to the mission. The only thing exceptional about her case is that she finally stood up to your bullying. Harrison sat down heavily in a chair. For the first time since Reeves had known him, he looked old and tired. What happens now? He asked. Now you're going to be transferred to Washington pending the completion of the investigation and possible court-martial proceedings, Reeves said. Depending on what the Justice Department decides, you may also face civil rights charges in federal court. Harrison's face went pale. Federal charges? Robert, what you've done isn't just a violation of military regulations. It's a violation of federal civil rights law. The Justice Department takes that very seriously. After leaving Harrison's quarters, Reeves went to the briefing room where the senior staff was waiting. She could see the tension and uncertainty in their faces. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, I'm here to inform you that Admiral Harrison has been relieved of command effective immediately. Captain Rodriguez will assume command of this vessel until a permanent replacement can be assigned. The officers exchanged glances but remained silent. I know you have questions about the investigation and what this means for the ship, Reeves continued. I can tell you that the investigation has revealed serious violations of Navy regulations and federal law. Admiral Harrison will be transferred off this ship immediately and will face appropriate legal proceedings. Lieutenant Commander Thompson raised his hand. Admiral, what about Commander Mitchell? Commander Mitchell will remain in her current position, Reeves replied. The allegations against her have been determined to be unfounded, and the transfer request has been permanently withdrawn. She paused and looked around the room. I want to be clear about something. What happened here is not acceptable in today's Navy. We are a military force that depends on the talents and dedication of all our personnel, regardless of gender, race, or background. When officers abuse their authority to discriminate against qualified personnel, they weaken our entire organization. Commander Johnson spoke up. Admiral, what should we tell the crew? Tell them the truth, Reeves said. That Admiral Harrison violated Navy regulations and has been relieved of command, that the ship will continue its mission under Captain Rodriguez's leadership, and that the Navy is committed to ensuring all personnel are treated fairly and with respect. After the briefing, Reeves asked to speak privately with Commander Mitchell. When Mitchell arrived, Reeves could see the strain that the past 6 weeks had taken on her. Mitchell looked tired and somewhat thinner than she had during their first meeting. Commander, Reeves began. First, I want to apologize on behalf of the Navy for what you've endured. The investigation has confirmed that Admiral Harrison's actions were completely inappropriate and illegal. Thank you, Admiral, Mitchell replied. I appreciate everything you've done. I also want you to know that this investigation revealed a much broader pattern of discrimination than we initially realized, Reeves continued. Your courage in standing up to Harrison has helped expose systematic violations that have affected many other female officers. Mitchell nodded. I'm glad something good came out of this. There's something else, Reeves said. The Justice Department is going to be contacting you about possibly testifying in federal court proceedings. Harrison and potentially several other officers may face criminal charges for civil rights violations. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Whatever you need me to do, Admiral. I also want you to know that there may be media attention once this becomes public, Reeves warned. The story of a decorated female officer standing up to discrimination in the Navy is going to generate significant interest. I understand, Mitchell said. But, Admiral, I didn't do this for publicity or to make a political statement. I just wanted to do my job without being harassed about my gender. I know, Reeves replied. But sometimes individual actions have broader consequences. Your willingness to fight back has created an opportunity to address problems that have been festering in the Navy for years. 3 months later, the story broke in the Washington Post under the headline, Navy Admiral Charged with Systematic Discrimination Against Female Officers. The article detailed Harrison's pattern of discriminatory behavior and quoted extensively from the communications that had been uncovered during the investigation. The reaction was immediate and intense. Women's rights organizations praised Commander Mitchell's courage and called for broader reforms in military personnel policies. Veterans groups were divided, with some supporting the prosecution and others claiming it was part of a broader attack on military traditions. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and the Secretary of the Navy was called to testify about what steps were being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. For Sarah Mitchell, the attention was overwhelming. She found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted, fielding interview requests from major news organizations and speaking invitations from advocacy groups. She declined most of the requests, preferring to focus on her military duties. But she did agree to testify at the congressional hearings, where she spoke about the importance of merit-based advancement and the waste of talent that occurred when qualified officers were sidelined because of discrimination. I didn't join the Navy to make a political statement, she told the committee. I joined to serve my country and to use my skills to defend American interests. All I've ever wanted is the opportunity to do that job without having my qualifications questioned because of my gender. Admiral Harrison was ultimately court-martialed and convicted of multiple charges related to his discriminatory conduct. He was dismissed from the Navy and stripped of his pension benefits. The Justice Department also filed civil rights charges, resulting in additional penalties and financial damages. Several other officers who had participated in the discriminatory network were also disciplined, though most received lesser punishments in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. The broader impact on the Navy was significant. New policies were implemented to prevent discrimination, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and training programs were expanded to address unconscious bias and ensure equal treatment. Admiral Reeves was promoted to Chief of Naval Operations, becoming the first woman to hold that position. In her first speech to the Naval Academy, she spoke about the importance of leadership and moral courage. True leadership, she said, is not about maintaining the status quo or protecting your own interests. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. It's about recognizing talent wherever you find it, and creating an environment where all personnel can contribute to their fullest potential. Commander Mitchell was promoted to captain and given command of her own submarine. On the day she took command, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to that moment, from the briefing room where Admiral Harrison had questioned her qualifications to the submarine where she now stood as commanding officer. She thought about all the female officers who had come before her and faced similar challenges without the support system that had ultimately helped her prevail. She thought about the young women who would enter the Navy in the future and hopefully face fewer barriers because of the changes that had resulted from her confrontation with Harrison. But mostly, she thought about the mission ahead. She had a submarine to command, a crew to lead, and a country to defend. After all the controversy and publicity, she was finally free to focus on what she had always wanted to do: serve her country as a naval officer. The incident that had started with Admiral Harrison's joke about her kill count had ultimately silenced not just him, but an entire network of discrimination that had operated in the shadows for years. The Navy was far from perfect, and there was still work to be done to ensure true equality of opportunity. But Sarah Mitchell's response to Harrison's challenge had proven that sometimes a single act of courage can create changes that extend far beyond the immediate situation. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who will come after you. As she looked out at the Pacific Ocean from her submarine's bridge, Captain Sarah Mitchell knew that her real victories weren't measured in enemy vessels destroyed or medals earned. They were measured in the opportunities that would now be available to the next generation of female naval officers. Opportunities that existed because someone had finally said enough and been willing to fight for what was right. The Admiral had joked about her kill count, thinking he could use it to embarrass and diminish her. Instead, her response had eliminated something far more dangerous than any enemy submarine: the systematic discrimination that had been undermining the Navy's effectiveness and betraying its values. In the end, that might be her most important victory of all.